In this tutorial, I'll show you how to create smooth, normalized, well-color balanced animations from your planet image datasets. The key to a good, visually appealing animation are consistent frame rate, spatial alignment, color balance, contrast, and luminance across all your frames. For this tutorial, I'm assuming you're already familiar with lucky imaging techniques and how to use your equipment and software. I'll provide some tips regarding automating your acquisition, stacking, and wavelet sharpening processes. Then we'll show how to process your stacked still frames in Photoshop with a few additional automation tips to streamline this process. There are other ways to produce animated GIFs or movies of your planet captures, but I like this workflow as it gives me control over each step and produces a well-balanced result so long as I have good data to start with. I'm using fire capture to image planets with my ASI224MC camera. And here I'm just showing the simulated Mars that comes with fire capture, but this is generally what my setup looks like when I'm imaging planets. So at this point I have already gone through my collimation and focusing and tuned my ADC, and you can find other videos from other people for how to do all those things. Once you're this far, I generally set my exposure time between 1 and 2 milliseconds. You got to keep it nice and short in order to catch the fleeting moments between fluctuations in atmospheric seeing. And then I dial up my gain until my histogram is peaking between 50% and 75%. You don't want to go any higher than that, and even 75% is kind of pushing it, because on some of the more in-focus frames you might get a few pixels on the polar caps that are brighter and in danger of clipping. Once you've set up your exposure, then you can open the Autorun feature in FireCap. This allows you to sequence a number of captures back to back with fairly precise timing, and this is essential for creating a smooth animation planet rotating. Here I've chosen to use 180-second capture durations, and for Mars you typically want not to go over about 4 or 5 minutes, otherwise Mars rotates a little bit too far during that capture period, and it'll tend to blur some of your detail. So I chose to use 3 minutes for this particular project. So with 3 minutes, you could just capture back to back without any significant delay between them, but for the sake of hard drive space and to have enough of a step between frames, I added a 60-second delay between captures. So each individual capture will span 4 minutes. It's 3 minutes of data recording plus 60 seconds of wait duration between. And so with 4 minutes each, if I capture 15 of those, then I stack up to about 1 hour of total duration for this animation. This tutorial focuses on creating animations from your planetary captures. However, the process that we're going through also lends itself well toward derotating your images to get a bit more detail than you'll get from any individual stack. In order to make that process a bit easier, it's a good idea to tick this box in the main settings, WinJupose file naming. That'll create timestamps in your raw capture file names that will save you a bit of time in WinJupose if you decide to do that later. Here's what a typical raw recording looks like through my setup, and this was on a fairly decent night. You can still see a bit of atmospheric fluctuation causing some wiggliness and blurring in the image, but this is almost as good as it gets with my equipment, a C925 and a 2X PowerMate. Here we're still 1 or 2 months away from opposition, so as Mars gets closer it'll look a little bit bigger and you'll be able to see a bit more detail in the raw image. But at this point I can clearly see the pull and a little bit of contrast between some light and dark regions on the surface, and I think I can make out a little bit of detail here, and so I'm confident that once I stack this that I'll get quite good detail out of it. I will be using Autostakkert to process my raw recordings into stacked still frames that I'll later use for my animation. If you're not already familiar with Autostakkert, I highly recommend going through this tutorial by YouTube user WWGEB. In Autostakkert, it's quite easy to process all of your source recordings together. If you go to Open Files and select your source files all together before clicking Open, it will show the first frame, and there you can set some alignment points, and then run the analysis, and then once you click Stack, it'll run the same processing over each of the files that you selected. So I start by typically, on Mars, I'll use fairly small alignment points, and I'll use multi-scale. I haven't really experimented with those settings to see if that works better than some other combination, but that intuitively seems like a good approach to me. Once you finish the initial analysis, you can get an idea of the quality of your data by looking at the histogram. In this case, I can see that the 50% quality crossover point is slightly to the right of my 50% frame count line. This gives me some confidence that if I select 5 or 10% or even 20% frames to use in the stack, that I'll be able to recover some detail in those frames. And so I'll go ahead and enter a few values up here. I'd like to take a look at the 5% stack and the 10% stack. And I'll let Autostakkert produce both of those stacks separately, and I'll manually check later which set I prefer. I'll also enable 3x drizzle, and I'll go ahead and stack. Once Autostakkert is done, I can get my first look at the stacked frames. Here I'm looking at the 5% stacks. Opening the first one, I can get an idea of how much detail I can expect to pull out once I go through wavelets and other enhancements later. I can also thumb through and get an initial look at what the animation might look like later. It's subtle, but I can see the surface features rotating across the view. That rotation will become more apparent after we do some sharpening. I'll use Registax 6 to do some initial color balance and also wavelet sharpening. I'll start by opening the first frame in my animation. This is the first 5% stack raw output from Autostakkert. My first action in Registax is going to be to get a better initial color balance. Before I do that, I'll open up the histogram function and we'll enable log-based graph. This lets me get a better idea of how each channel tapers off on the brighter side of the histogram for each channel. I'll close that and open up RGB balance. Here I can see that the blue channel is quite dim compared to the red and green channels, and this is why my initial color balance is quite greenish looking, greenish yellow, not appealing at all. I'll start by hitting auto balance, and that will bring the channels into better alignment, but still not quite where I want it. From there, I'll manually tweak the channels until the 3 channels converge at the same point on the brightest part of the image. What I'm doing here is neutralizing the white of the south polar cap, since that happens to be the brightest part of my image. This works well if the brightest part of your image happens to be ideally a neutral white, as is the case usually with Mars and also with Jupiter. So in this case, I need to boost my red in order to match the green and the blue. So I'll start with a few tweaks there. And I'll bump up green just a bit. And we're getting close. One more nudge of the red. And now I've got that beautiful, bright reddish Mars color with a neutral white ice cap. This process also balances the brightness of my image because it brings the brightest point into, in this case, right about 75% of the dynamic range of my image, which is right about where I want it, because as I start sharpening, the histogram will start to push to the right, and I need to be careful not to get too far over there, otherwise I'll start clipping some of the color channels on the polar cap. I'm now ready to begin wavelet sharpening. I'll do this by reloading a preset which I defined earlier in this season. This preset works well for Mars with my particular setup, and you'll find that you'll need to experiment with the settings in order to find something that you like for your particular set of equipment and conditions. This preset uses dyadic wavelet scheme and Gaussian wavelet filter. I usually leave layer 1 disabled, as I find this tends to overemphasize pixel scale noise, even though I do see that there is some useful structure potentially in that layer. Even with a ton of denoise on that layer, I still won't be able to recover that structure without amplifying noise more than I'm comfortable with. So I'll leave that layer disabled. Layers 2 and 3 tend to be much better matches for the scale of detail that I'm looking for. Layer 2 did need a little bit of denoise in order to clean up some of the inherent noise there, but layers 2 and 3 both are good matches. Layers 4, 5, and 6 tend to amplify broad scale contrast a bit more than I like. They tend to make the image look over processed, and so I'm leaving those 3 layers disabled. The next thing I need to do is double check my color balance, because sharpening will have enhanced some of the boundaries around the pole and various other things. And now I see that my histogram has moved up to the right, and that's because of some of the wavelet sharpening, where it brightens up things on the bright side of the intensity boundaries. So I need to dial those back down. It would be fine as is if this was the only image I was processing, but I'm intending to apply the same settings to all of my images. And if I happen to have one in the set that's a little bit sharper than the others, then that one will be in danger of blowing out the color on the pole cap if I were to use the same color balance settings for that image. So I'll dial back each setting and bring it back to about 75%. And I'm back to neutral colors again. Now that I've worked out the wavelet settings and color balance that I like for the initial image, leaving a little bit of buffer on the color balance so that using the same settings on the other images won't blow out the caps, I am now ready to apply these settings to all of the rest of my images. So I'll start by opening the batch window. And here I will want to create a macro that starts with color balance. So I'll use the function here. I will select RGB balance, and I will add that to this macro. I then select wavelet, and this is basically going to use the current settings, the current wavelet settings that I have selected, and I can enter something here like say Mars animation sharp, and I'll add that to my macro process. The last thing I need to do here is save the wavelet. So in this case, I'll choose PNG, and I won't add a prefix or suffix to the file name. And the reason for that is that if I was to stick with a TIF, then it would overwrite the files. If I was to use TIF but have a prefix or suffix, then those won't import well into WinJupose. So I found that it's convenient to use PNG and not have an additional prefix or suffix on the file name. That way I can still import these in WinJupose. So I now have the 3 operations configured in my macro. I can then save this as Mars animation, save. And now I can run that operation. So I start by selecting the macro I just defined and then adding files to that process. So I'll find my source files. And I'm in the right folder, but the files won't show up until you add a file name mask. In this case, I'll do star.tif. And that will show all of my Autostakkert raw stacks. So I'll select the entire set and I'll open those. And then I'm ready to run that batch process on these files. So I'll go ahead and hit run. I now have 15 PNG files, each corresponding to the 15 source frames, recordings, and these are the output of the Registax initial color balance and wavelet sharpening processing. I can take a quick look and just see how those came out, and I can see quite a bit more detail than we saw in the Autostakkert output, and so this is looking good so far. But you will see some artifacts. You'll see some halos, some outlines around. You'll also, as I thumb through these, you'll see that some of them have brighter backgrounds. You'll also see a little bit of fluctuation between kind of a greenish yellowish tone and an orange tone, but that's okay. We'll clean that up in Photoshop. So as I thumb through this, you can also see a few of them are not quite as sharp as the others. But this is coming along, and I can see that we'll have good detail for the final animation. Next, we'll go to Photoshop. I'm now working in Photoshop CC, and here I will open all 15 images as separate layers. I do this by, under the File menu, go to Scripts, and load files into Stack. I will then select my 15 source frames. These are the PNGs that were created by Registax. I moved them to a subfolder just for better organization. Once those have loaded into the file list, I'll hit OK, and it's not necessary to use the alignment feature here because Autostakkert should have done that for you. It'll take a minute to load all of the layers. Now that I've loaded all 15 of my pre-processed frames into individual layers here, I can take a look at the individual layers by holding down the Alt key while clicking the Show Hide buttons here. And then I can see already that I have quite a bit of variation in the background color, and also in the planet itself. There's a little bit of, even though I did some initial color balance earlier, I still need to do some work to get even color balance across all the frames. Our goal here is to have even color balance and also even histograms across the frames in order to avoid having the animation flicker as it's moving between frames. Another thing to notice after I loaded my images is that it puts the oldest, the first captured frame at the top of the stack and the last frame at the bottom, which is inconvenient for my animation layer. So I'll go ahead and reverse that by going up to the layer menu, and under Arrange, I will reverse those layers. That'll come in handy later. And so now I can use the topmost layer to start to experiment with a curves adjustment layer and see the effect of that. If I pull down quite sharply at on the far left here, then that will just about neutralize my background color. But I need to add an anchor point to bring the brightness of the center of the planet back up. So that's a decent stretch. It brought out quite a bit of detail, and it did an okay job on the left limb here, where it should be fading to black. It didn't clip it too strongly over there. The next thing I want to do is revisit the color balance. So I'll do that by selecting any one of the content layers, in this case the top one just for convenience. I'll go to Image, Adjustments, Levels, and I will select the white eyedropper. and we'll select near the center of the polar ice cap. And so that really boosted my reds. Now it's looking like traditional Mars color, and I'm kind of excited to see a little bit of this haze on the other pole, which I think is clouds, but I'm not certain. You can also use the gray eyedropper if you want, and kind of click around on some of the gray area, the areas that you might consider to be grayish. And at this point, you're really just getting a color balance that you think looks good to your tastes. I think that looks good, so I'll go ahead and hit OK. I now have great color in my first layer, and I want to match the color in these other layers to that of the first. And I found the most consistent way to do that is not using the same levels adjustment that we did on the first layer, but rather to use the match color tool on all of the other layers. However, this tool works best if you select the region of the source image that you want to match on the other images, rather than using the entire frame, in which case the tool is going to do its best to match the blackness and won't do as good a job on the planet itself. In order to select the planet, for the sake of focusing the color match tool, I'll make sure that I have the top content layer selected, and I'll use the magic wand tool to select the blackness of space. Inverting that selection using the Control-Shift-I shortcut, you can do the same through the selection menu. Now zooming in, I can see that the selection overhangs the planet a little bit, which is what I want. I don't want it to cut into the planet. From there, I will feather that selection just a bit. How about 5 pixels? I'm now ready to match the color balance of the second layer to that of the first, but I want to do this in a way that I can repeat the same process for all of my other layers. So I'll do this using the actions. First, I will hide the top layer, which is the one that I previously adjusted, so that I'm now looking at the second layer from the top in my source frames. And I will then begin a new macro here. I'll call this match color. And while it's recording, I'll go to Image, Adjustment, Match Color. Here I will select the same file. In this case it's called Untitled1 just because I haven't saved it. And I'll select the layer that I previously adjusted, which was this one with the timestamp 1101. That was the topmost layer. And I can see in my preview that indeed it now has adjusted the second layer from the top to match the color balance of the first, and it looks great. I'll hit OK. And now I could stop the macro here, but for convenience, it'd be nice if it could then select the next layer down. That way, I can just hit the button repeatedly to apply the same change, and it'll just bounce down through the layers. So the keyboard shortcut for that is Alt open bracket, and I will stop my macro recording there. And I'll go ahead and make sure that indeed I can see that the color balance of the second layer looks like a pretty good match to that of the first. And now, knowing that my macro starts by doing the match color process on the selected layer, I'll just manually select the next layer in my stack, layer 3. And if I run this macro, it will match the color to the first layer, and then it will select the next layer in the stack, meaning it'll bump the selection down to the next layer. And so I'll go ahead and do that. Now my third layer should match the first, and it has selected the fourth. I'll do it again, and my fourth layer now matches the first, and so on. And so now I can just keep pressing that button until it gets to the bottom of the stack. Now it's gone through all the layers, and I can inspect just to make sure that they all have done the same thing. And it looks like they all match the first. I now want to mask out the blackness of space. Even though our levels, our curve adjustment brought down the blacks, and they look more in line at this point, I still might as well just make it a perfect black and make sure that there's no variation there. So to do that, since I already have a nice selection here, I'll actually expand this a little bit. Select expand. And let's give that something like 10 pixels extending out into space, and that will allow us to feather this a bit. Let's say 8 pixels, a little bit less than my selection, so that I know it's not feathering all the way back into the planet. And now I can create a new layer. Also, I want to invert that selection because I want to fill the blackness with black. So I'll go to Edit, Fill, and select Black. And I now have a nice black overlay, where if I were to hide that, and also if I were to hide my curves adjustment, then you would see it's more apparent that it's blocking out that background. It's less apparent when I have the curves, but it's still a worthwhile investment to black out the background there. The next step I like to do is to add a bit of denoising and then sharpening. The details are all right as is, but you can see a fair bit of noise, including color noise and luminance noise. It looks a little bit like a basketball. So what I would like to do is start by selecting, make sure I've got the top layer selected, and I'm going to create a macro for this like we did earlier. I'll make a new macro, call it denoise, then sharpen. And the first thing I'll do is just go to Filter, Noise, and use the basic Reduce Noise function. Here I will dial up color denoise all the way. This preview isn't going to update, but you can watch the main window here and see the effect with and without. Right now I think that's a bit too much denoising and luminance, so I'm going to dial that slider back. And see how it looks in real time in the main window as I adjust that. It's looking a little bit less like a basketball. And find the right settings that you like. I'll hit OK. Then I will go into sharpening and use the Smart Sharpen is what I use here. So just play with the sliders until you get an effect that you like. I have a tendency to overdo this sometimes, trying to pull out specific structure. And so be careful of that. If you use too much radius and or amount here, you'll get quite a dramatic effect. About 3.5 pixels and 200% is kind of a sweet spot that I like. So I like the look of this so far, and just like we did earlier, I want to select the next layer, so I'll do Alt open bracket, and I will stop the recording of my macro. So this way I should be able to, and I can see that is looking quite a bit smoother, yet still has some good detail in it. I should be able to just play through each layer, repeat that macro on each layer individually. I kind of like the smoother look, even though it's very tempting to over sharpen the image when you're focusing on specific structure that you want to bring out. It's easy to get carried away with that and really let the noise get away from you. At this point, you can get a preview of what the animation is going to look like. So I'll click Create Frame Animation, and then over here on this button here, I'll select Make Frames from Layers. And you'll notice that it creates a frame from every layer, including your adjustment layers, which is not exactly what I want. So I'll just click, I'll highlight those 2 adjustment layers and click the trash can here to take them out of my animation. And now the next thing to notice is that by default, it's showing the first frame is going to show the first layer here, but it has all of the other layers hidden. And so what you need to do is show that background mask and the curve stretch. And by doing that, it shows those 2 layers for all the other frames as well. So you should be seeing the composite at this point. And now let's take a look. So one thing I'm noticing is there's still some fluctuation in detail that's just unavoidable. That was atmospheric fluctuation, but I'm happy with the color balance. It looks quite smooth. I'm happy with the level of detail. I don't think I overdid the sharpening or denoising. But one thing that catches your eye is a lot of fairly dramatic fluctuation right here along that rind, which is an artifact that we're not able to take out of the image through any methodical means, and so I'll put a mask over that. At this point, you can decide for yourself if you want to do anything about that rind. I like to clean it up just to have a smoother look to my animation, even though it's clearly an artistic touch. I'll be painting over the rind essentially. So I'll do this by duplicating my top layer, and I'm going to try and hone in on just that part that becomes dark in successive frames. And I want to blur through it, and I want to lighten it up. So here it'll just be a matter of adjustments to taste. I'm going to use the dodge tool to lighten up this part of it. Make sure you're using a low opacity, so you have to go over a region multiple times in order to smooth that out. Otherwise, you'll get hard edges. I'm also using a fully soft brush here. It still doesn't look great. I'm going to next delete, get rid of the black background. I'll set my tolerance a bit higher so I can select more of the background. I'll cut that in a little bit. And I'll just delete that background so that I'm left with just the planet. The reason I want to do this is my next step is going to be to first select, do Control A to select the whole frame, and then I'll Gaussian blur this. That'll clean up some of the roughness on some of this edge. And so with that Gaussian blur, if I had left the black space, then that's going to bring some of that blackness into the planet. And so deleting the black background prevents that to an extent. 4 pixels, I'll use 4 pixels, sure, why not? And now I've got this blurred out Mars image with the rind really just blurred out and hidden. But what I want to do is create a mask for this, where most of this I do not want to be shown. So I'll use a black mask over this, and then I'll paint in where I want the rind to show. And now I can paint. Use a white brush to paint onto my my mask the areas where I want to include the blurred out rind section, and so I'll paint that in. So I'm drawing white into my my mask. I think that'll be pretty good, I think. So here's before and after. I think that's done a nice job. You can take a look at what that rind overlay looks like. If I just isolate that layer and zoom in, it's basically just a bunch of blurry junk with soft edges. So this will lay on top of the detail in other layers. And it's not 100% opaque, so you will see some of the rind showing through from other layers. Just a few more minor touches and we'll be ready to regenerate the animation. I like to rotate my image at this point to have the south pole toward the bottom. You could make it straight down if you wanted to, but I'll just do a 180-degree rotation. I kind of like it tilted a little bit like this. And at this point, the animation will be a little bit confused by some of the layer selections we did, and so you really just have to start that over. So go delete animation, then make sure that all of your layers are visible. I do select all layers and then show layers. Which is Control, comma in this case. And then do make frames from layers. We've got all the frames, and we need to delete, like we did earlier, delete those frames. We'll keep the layers, but we need to delete those frames. Then go to the first frame and show the top 3 adjustment layers. By enabling those 3, it enables the same adjustments on all of the frames. So now let's take a look at it. It's getting much smoother now. You still see some fluctuation just due to atmospheric seeing. The rind, I think, is much less of a dramatic flickering there. I'm happy with the detail on the fade to black around the edges, and it's looking quite good. I like it. At this point, you can decide if you like a one-way animation, meaning it'll rotate this direction and then jump back to the start, or if you like a back and forth rotation. If you like the back and forth, the way to do that is to copy these frames. So I just selected all of my frames. Then I will do copy frames and paste frames, and select paste after selection. And now it would, if you were to play this, it would look like it rotates this way and then jumps back to the start here and then repeats that again. And so what we can do here is reverse the second half that should still be selected and reverse those. So now we have 30 total frames. The first half is rotating this way, the second half are rotating the other way. But what's something to be aware of is that right there in the middle, You're rotating one direction, and then when it switches direction, you'll have one frame repeated twice, and so I don't think that looks good in the back and forth. So I usually delete that duplicate layer. So I now have 29 instead of 30 total layers. And then let's take a look. Going one way, and then reverses and goes the other way. That's looking pretty good. This is a good point to decide if you want to crop at all. I might as well, I think, in this case. So I'll do something like that. I kind of like kind of a like 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 look. Image crop. And then you can export to a GIF. If you go to export, save to web legacy. It'll take a minute to generate the color palette. What it's doing is reducing the color set to the 256 most prominent colors in your image, and it does a pretty good job. Even though this is only 256 colors, it doesn't look like 8-bit like you might think with a 256 color palette. It's 256 shades of useful colors, in other words. And so at this point, you can also consider downscaling, down, say, 50%, which would not be a bad idea here, since a lot of my structure really is quite fuzzy, and arguably I've upscaled more than my data really allows. But let's take a look at the preview. Oh, that looks cool. You can also, if you wanted to, if it's going too fast, you can make an adjustment on the main page. I'll show you how to do that now. If I cancel that, make sure I select all my frames. I already have them selected. Then on the first one, select, for example, say 0.1 seconds or 0.2 seconds per frame. And you could show it here, but it doesn't necessarily do a great job with the preview. I'll try again with the export, save for web legacy. Let's see if that timing looks a little bit slower. Yeah, that looks better to my eye. At this point, you can go ahead and save. If you're posting to cloudy nights and you're trying to fit under the 500 kilobyte upload limit, then you could add some lossiness to the image here by increasing this, and it adds some sort of compression, I guess. I'll go ahead and export that. Mars demo GIF. And here's the final product. I think it looks cool. It's quite smooth. It doesn't look over-processed to my eye anyway. It's the color balance is nice and even. It doesn't seem to flicker. The rind is quite a bit smoother, and it has this kind of cool shiny marble look to it when you get that little bit of haze at the North Pole. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I hope you found some part of it useful. Please drop a line if you have any questions or comments, or if you have some animations of your own to share. Please do. I'd love to see them. Thanks for watching.